Hi everyone, this is the second lecture of week 10. And again, please keep up with your other reading assignments. Despite me not going over some of them on the video, they may show up for the quiz. Um, as we discussed last time, with the introduction of David on the scene, it is clear that the power, both kind of theological and political power has shifted from Saul to David. And it's not just Saul who becomes increasingly aware that these kind of political power shifts, okay? But also we are told in the chapters that I'm going to discuss, Saul's family is becoming keenly aware that the shift in these kind of small, minute shifts of power. And the two most important family members that David will come to have a relationship with is Saul's firstborn son, Jonathan, who is the heir apparent, and Saul's second daughter, Michal, who will go on to marry David. Okay, so let's begin with the story about Jonathan and David, which some readers have characterized as a description of a homosexual relationship. Okay, the problem with that interpretation, of course, is that that's a very modern designation. It's very hard to know exactly if that's what's being implied in an ancient text. The closest we can say is that maybe it's a homoerotic text, okay? Anyway, the relationship that is between Jonathan and David is described in two separate chapters in 1 Samuel 18, and 1 Samuel 20, okay? But before I go on to talk about, when they meet and the relationship between the two, we have to first look at the character of Jonathan a little bit more, okay? In 1 Samuel 14, in a story that is kind of bookended by the two stories of Saul's two misdeeds, okay? It describes how Jonathan and his armor bearer by themselves decide to, go fight the Philistines who are encamped and score a great victory, okay? We are told in 1 Samuel 14 that while Jonathan is doing this, right, and unbeknownst to Jonathan, Saul decides to be extra pious by swearing an oath stating that anybody who eats anything, that they're all gonna fast, right, and whoever breaks the fast will die, okay? Well, Jonathan, not hearing this vow, as he is out fighting, eats a bit of honey, and we're told when Saul finds this out, he is ready to kill Jonathan, okay, his son and his heir, okay? Indeed, notice already his eagerness, that is Saul's eagerness to kill his own son, already hints that the relationship between father and son is not, completely correct, and one even wonders if Saul's a little jealous of Jonathan's military prowess, okay? And now, what we are told in 1 Samuel 14 is that though Saul is perfectly willing to go through with the vow, right, the troops are not. Why? Because Jonathan has just come back as a great military hero, so they intercede for Jonathan, and so Jonathan lives, right? But of course, as we've seen in the biblical text, a vow once uttered, it cannot be undone, okay? So notice what the purpose of the story might be. Okay, notice that the story attempts to talk about why Jonathan, right, who is this great military hero, the heir apparent, why he does not end up obtaining Saul's throne, right? Why? Well, it's because his father stupidly made this vow and cursed him to his death. Okay, and notice in saying that who they're trying to take the blame off of. Therefore, it's Saul's fault Jonathan didn't obtain the throne, not David. Okay, um, so hence what the writers are doing is trying to draw a contrast between Saul and Jonathan. Okay, notice that Jonathan, in contrast to Saul, is depicted extremely positively in the text. He is good. He's a good warrior. He's beloved by troops. He has a God on his side. Seems to be very popular with the people. Okay, this positive portrayal of Jonathan seems to hint that Jonathan posed a unique problem for David and his writers. Okay, though the writers could disparage Saul to some degree, okay, they had a much more difficult time explaining why, however, God did not choose the beloved war hero Jonathan. Okay, in short, the writers had to explain why Jonathan did not become king instead of David. Okay, and they have to do so without making Jonathan look really bad. Well, why can't they just make Jonathan look as bad? Well, again, Jonathan seems to have been rather beloved by his community. He seems to have been a well-known military hero, so you can't really just badmouth him. Okay. Also, remember that they are. This is a tribal society, meaning that each person comes from a particular tribe, and it seems that Jonathan was indeed a favored member of the tribe of Benjamin, right? And unfortunately for David, even though he does obtain the kingship, still needs the support of the Benjaminites, and so he cannot really go out off, sort of bad mouthing everyone, especially somebody who is popular with this tribe. Okay. Um, so of course, what we're seeing here with the kind of positive portrayal of David, of Jonathan, is that the pro-Davidic writers, that is the writers employed by David and probably his descendants, when they come to how to explain Jonathan, they try a different tactic. They blame Jonathan's failure to obtain the throne not on Jonathan, right, who they say is really great, but on Saul, who curses his own son. Okay, and notice how, again, what the writers are doing is trying to, they try to depict Saul and Jonathan's relationship as already fractured. Okay, indeed, we are told that in 1 Samuel 14, verse 29, when Jonathan finds out about his father's stupid oath, he says, he declares, my father has brought trouble to this land. Okay, this is, certainly the biblical writers hint of deep problems between the two. Okay, so another way that, and really what the writers are doing, again, like I said, is to draw a contrast between Jonathan and Saul, and to show them as not quite close. Okay, and in so doing, what they're trying to do, of course, ultimately, is to blame Jonathan's demise on Saul. Okay, another way, or part of this, particular portrayal, has to do with kind of dichotomizing or contrasting now David and Saul. Okay, just as Jonathan is not close to David, just as Jonathan is not close to Saul, so Jonathan, however, is close to David. Right, and what you see in the text is that there's a portrayal of Jonathan as almost preferring David over against his own father, and maybe over against his own rightful position as the heir. Okay, and this preference by Jonathan for David over against his own family and over against his position, you see this right away from the very beginning point when they meet in 1 Samuel 18. And this is right after the Goliath story. So 1 Samuel 18 verses 1 and following. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul, this word nephesh, the nephesh of Jonathan was bound to the nephesh of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own nephesh. Okay, Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul or nephesh. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even the sword, and his bow, and his belt. Okay, so and this kind of stripping, as well as this kind of declaration of love, this is in part why people have maybe argued this is a homosexual relationship, possibly even that it depicts Jonathan as kind of feminizing himself in front of David, who is pictured as more masculine. So certainly there may be homoerotic subtext there. Okay. However, the problem with, like all biblical texts, the meaning is not really clear. And this text in particular, it's very hard to figure out what exactly is going on, because the key terms in this passage, like nephesh, which translated here as soul, and the word ahav, even the word love, ahav, is, these two important words that are repeated in this passage, they are almost impossible to translate. Okay, so for example, this word that is translated as soul, nephesh, which I kept trying to translate as nephesh instead, loved him as his own soul, bound with, with the soul of the. Okay, so the problem with nephesh is that it is used, I think, 734 times. It's used a bunch of times in the Hebrew. And here are the variety of things nephesh can refer to. It can refer to an animal, right? Which is certainly not how we mean soul now, I think, right? It can also refer to a person's affections, how they feel, right? Their appetites, what they want, kind of on a kind of medium carnal basis, maybe. Their mind as well, their will, their activity, as well as their internal living component. Okay, it is not at all clear that what is meant by nefesh is that that this thing is something eternal, as we mean soul now. Okay, but notice all the variety of things it can mean. It can mean one's feelings. It can mean one's will, one's rational mind. It can also mean something animate. Okay, so this term is very unclear. Okay, equally complicated is the term aha, the word that is the term for love in the biblical text. Okay, certainly this word has connotations about feeling. Okay, however, in the biblical text, love is used in a very, very particular manner much of the time to discuss politics or political agreements. Okay, so for example, the place where love occurs, the word ahav occurs the most in the biblical text is Deuteronomy. Well, Deuteronomy is one long legal agreement. It's one long covenant. Okay, as if the word love is infused with political connotations. Okay, and indeed, Jonathan does, if you look at 1 Samuel 18, this kind of passage where they first meet, okay, does do some very strange things that suggest that whatever the characters may have felt about each other, the most important aspect of the relationship was that they saw each other as political allies. Okay, notice that Jonathan not only makes a covenant, and I'm going to talk about the covenant in a bit more in a minute, right? Which is very strange, okay, to do that with somebody you just met, but okay. Not only does he make a covenant, but Jonathan, we are told, strips off his robe, armor, sword, bow, and belt. I mean, what is he wearing at the end, right? Is he? Now, certainly he's kind of stripping, but the more important thing is what these things that he takes off symbolizes, especially the robe. Okay, and what these items symbolize is, Jonathan's royal military and political status. Okay, so really what's important here is not necessarily the stripping, right? But it's the fact that he seems to be taking off these things that are symbolically meaningful and giving them over to David. Okay, like, I mean, this may be homoerotic, okay, but definitely, but more clearly, it signifies almost a transference by Jonathan of his, right to the throne to this other guy, David. Okay, now knowing that, does this really sound like something any kind of intelligent person would do? Like, why would Jonathan just give to this guy all of his, symbols of power? So, I mean, so then you have to ask a slightly different question, right? We know what the text says happened, but the text is quite biased, right? It's written by David's descendants and their hired writers, right? So the slightly different question is, well, what might have happened instead? And again, we have to find clues to what happened instead in this kind of propagandistic text, okay? So that's the tricky part, okay? So let's take a closer look at what happens between the two. Well, first of all, let's go back to this covenant, okay, that they make, which we are told in 18:3, right? We're told that they make a covenant, right? Why would two guys, especially if they're meeting for the first time, but let's say they're not, I mean, we don't know, why would these two guys need a formal legal agreement in the first place? What may be, what might the covenant or this legal agreement be about? Like, are they transferring, their motorcycle? Like, what are they transferring here? Okay. Or what are they making a legal agreement about? Okay. Well, the Hebrew seems to hint a little bit about what this covenant might actually entail. Okay. It states in 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. Okay, this again, the soul part, right? That Jonathan's nephesh was bound. Okay, and this word bound is extremely telling, right? It's this word nikshara, it's a nifal, if you guys are taking Hebrew, and it's from the root kashar. Okay, so it says that Jonathan's nephesh or soul or whatever was bound, nikshara, with the nephesh of David. Okay, this word kashar can mean bound, certainly, okay, but usually they mean bound in a very particular manner. They mean, the term means to bind or to join together, right? But a lot of times it means to join together or be bound in agreement to conspire or form a rebellion. That is a political rebellion. Okay. In short, kashar is politically tinged language that suggests overthrow of the current person in power. Okay. And considering that, nefesh can mean the mind, okay? Not necessarily feelings per se, right? And considering that love also has political connotation, when you put that together with kashar, meaning conspiracy, well, all of this hints that whatever is going on between David and Jonathan, that it is political in nature, okay? Indeed, in a later story, after David flees from Saul, he meets up with Jonathan again in 1 Samuel 20. And here we are told that Jonathan and David make an even more detailed covenant, okay? And in 1 Samuel 20, the political meaning between the or in the covenants is undeniable, okay? In 1 Samuel 20, Jonathan and David agree in the new covenant, or maybe more detailed covenant, that they will not side against each other or fight against each other in the civil war that is coming, but instead will work together, probably behind the scenes in Jonathan's case, right? And that no matter who ends up on top, they both agree not to wipe out each other's families, that is to kill every male member of their house, okay? So this is what it says in 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 and following. If I am still alive, this is Jonathan talking, if I am still alive, show me the faithful love, right? Remember, love has a political connotation of the Lord, but if I die, never cut off your faithful love from my house, even if the Lord were to cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Thus, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord seek out the enemies of David. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own life, right? And again, love, yes, does have connotations of feeling, okay? But again, love has political connotations, okay? So what might have actually happened between Jonathan and David? Okay, well, likely David and Jonathan probably did make a covenant, maybe more than one covenant, it's not clear, okay? But perhaps not the one that's described in the biblical text where Jonathan kind of oddly and stupidly gives over everything to David, okay? That doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? Rather, it seems much more likely that this covenant was mutually beneficial, okay? And notice that in 1 Samuel 18, it is Jonathan who approaches David, okay? So what might the covenant have really been about, right? Likely, Jonathan, seeing the rise of David, seeing how popular David was getting, probably needed David to help him out, right? Well, with what, right? Probably Jonathan wanted to, right? He's a military hero, he's beloved, right? He seems to be very smart. He seems to be having some disagreements with his father, right? He probably wanted to come to the throne earlier than waiting for his father to die. Okay, and perhaps, that's what he wanted David's help with. David's really popular. Perhaps they agree that if David helps Jonathan come to the throne faster, that David maybe will will become second in charge. Okay, perhaps these covert meetings that they're talking about is to discuss a conspiracy. Okay, so like I said, notice that the timing of Jonathan's covenant with David is very telling. Okay, notice that Jonathan wants or makes a covenant with David when his star is rising, right? As if the covenant was for a mutually beneficial purpose. Okay, indeed, of course, it is not just Jonathan who loves David. Okay, we are told that everybody loves David, right? So 1 Samuel 18:16, again in 18:28, it states that all of Israel and Judah love David. 1 Samuel 18:22 states that Saul's servant, that is those in the royal court, well, they love David. Likewise, we're told that Saul's daughter Michal, like her brother Jonathan, also loves David in 1 Samuel 18:20. Moreover, we are told repeatedly that God was with him in, for example, 1 Samuel 18, verse 14. Okay. Again, if love has political meanings, right, then notice that the soldiers, the people, the royal court, even the royal family, God, right? When they say they all love David, the text is not saying, that they found David, especially delightful. Maybe they do, but that's not quite what they mean. What they're trying to insinuate is that all these people are lining up behind David politically, okay? Either trying to use him to obtain their own or to help their own political maneuverings, or lining up to make David more politically powerful. Okay, now Saul seems to have slowly realized the growing threat to power that David comes to represent. Okay, and we are told that eventually Saul gets so angry and so jealous at the growing reputation and power of David that he starts raving around and trying to kill David. Okay, and he tries to kill David twice. Okay, in 1 Samuel 18 verses 9 and 11. Okay, and every time Saul does this, the biblical writer just kind of excuses his behavior and says, well, Saul being crazy as usual and being paranoid. Okay, now of course what we know is Saul's not being paranoid, right? The threat that he feels is a real threat. Okay, so notice what the biblical text does, right? Okay, how it kind of delegitimizes Saul's position. Okay, and we are told that at some point Saul, fearful and suspicious, of David, makes a very bad, stupid political mistake. Okay, we are told that hoping to get David covertly killed off, he promises David that if he does a very difficult task, if he kills 100 Philistines and gets their foreskins, that he would give Michal, his daughter, to David in marriage, right? And we are told, of course, earlier in 1 Samuel 18:20 that, of course, Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Okay, so again, notice what Saul does. Saul is trying to use the love of Michal to try to get David killed off, right? But of course, this is unsuccessful, right? David immediately goes out, kills 100 Philistines, takes their foreskins, and now Saul is forced to marry off his daughter to David. Okay, and this is a very, very bad decision because now what has Saul done, right? Once David marries Saul's daughter, right, David becomes part of the family, right? And therefore what Saul has done is given David more of a claim, more of a right to claim his throne. Why? Because now David can claim that he's not a usurper, but the part of the family of Saul. Okay. Indeed, things get so bad eventually between, I'm condensing what is a lot of text, right? Things get so bad between David and Saul that eventually David flees, okay? And who helps David flee? Well, of course, again, Saul's own family, right? Again, showing how alone Saul is becoming, okay? First, in 1 Samuel 19, verses 1 and 2, it states that Jonathan warns David to hide and run from his own father, okay? And then Jonathan even goes so far as to make his father promise not to kill David, okay? However, immediately after Saul promises Jonathan that he won't kill David, we are told that a bad spirit comes over Saul in 1 Samuel 19, verses 9 and following. And of course, what does he do? He tries to kill David, okay? Notice how Saul's, understanding of what's going on, his political intelligence is always dismissed in the text as Saul being paranoid or afflicted by an evil spirit, okay, and not as something real, though it, of course, ends up being something quite real, okay? At this point, when Saul tries to kill him twice, we are told that David has to flee again, and this time he gets help not from Jonathan, but Jonathan's sister Michal, that is David's wife and Saul's daughter. Okay, and then the replay of this kind of Rachel and Teraphim story way back earlier in Genesis. Indeed, some scholars do think that David was responsible for the editing of some of the stories in the patriarchal narratives. Okay, so this is what happened in a kind of replay of that. We're told that Michal helps David escape by using a teraphim, these household gods. Okay, so verse 11. Okay. So Saul sent messengers to David's house to keep watch over him, planning to kill him in the morning. And David's wife Michal told him, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled and escaped. And Michal took a teraphim, an idol, laid it on her bed, and she put a net of goat's hair on his head and covered it with clothes. And when Saul's messengers sent, when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "Oh, he's sick." And then Saul sent the messengers to see David for themselves, and he said, "Bring him up to me in bed that I may kill him." And when the messengers came in, the teraphim was in the bed with a covering of goat's hair on his head. And Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this? And let the enemy go so that he has escaped." And Michal answered, "He said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you?" Okay. So, I mean, notice that both Jonathan and Michal help David escape, and why did they do that? It seems pretty stupid politically. Is Saul, their father, really this hateful? Okay. Likely all these stories, especially about Saul's family, it hints of a court intrigue. Okay, where all the members of the court and most importantly Saul's immediate family, right? They're all jostling for power. Okay, and it seems that Michal and Jonathan were themselves trying to use David, an army general who everyone notices is rising in power and reputation, to kind of obtain more power maybe for themselves. Okay, of course, not just Michal and Jonathan. We are told that the prophet Samuel, who anoints David earlier, he's probably also playing this political game, right? Hoping to use David to overthrow Saul and maybe obtain a better position at the end. Okay. Um, like I said before, Jonathan too is probably using David to help overthrow his father earlier so that Jonathan, can become, king instead. Michal too is probably trying to use David. Well, how so, right? Michal too is aware, likely, that either Jonathan or David, right, is probably going to come to the throne in place of her father. Okay, and if so, then she's in a great position, right? She's both close allies with her brother Jonathan, and David at this point. So she can either be married to the second in charge of the country, or perhaps she's even hoping that David will win. If so, what? She becomes queen. Okay. However, what these characters fail to realize is that David is, it's not just them using David. David, in turn, is using all of them. And it is David, not Jonathan, not Michal, not even Samuel, who will end up on top. Okay. Indeed, Saul and his entire Saul and his entire family will end up becoming victims of David and his rise. Right. We are told at the very end of this book that Jonathan ends up dead alongside his father. And that little agreement that they made, between, that agreement between Jonathan and David about how, David is not going to kill off all the heirs. Well, David kind of abides by that, but only like barely, right? All of Saul's sons and heirs, probably including the sons of Jonathan, who we don't hear about, they all end up dead. The only person left alive is, this guy named Mishbosheth, or Mishbaal. He has two different names. The crippled son of Jonathan, who is probably only left alive because he has a disability and therefore not easily able to obtain the throne. Okay. As for Michal, she is given to another to marry. After David flees, she's given to another man. When David attains the throne, David, of course, realizing that Michal is his only real legitimate connection to Saul's family, the only thing that makes David not a usurper, forces her to return to him. Okay, and of course later, Michal's story has a very, very sad ending. Later in 2 Samuel 6, when the Ark of the Covenant is being moved into Jerusalem, we are told that Michal is looking out the one window and sees David dancing. Okay, and when David returns, she makes this kind of cutting remark about how David's dancing is lewd and vulgar. Okay, and to this little remark, David says, well, it's better than, it's perfectly fine for God who chose me over your father. So there's a little, little scuffle between the two. And the story ends with the explanation that Michal, almost as a result, right, had no children, right? As if to blame Michal's childlessness on this tiff with David. Okay. Likely he's not tiff because of his dancing. He's probably tiff because he killed off all the members of her family. Okay. Moreover, the story about this little tiff seems to mainly be targeted to explain why Michal remained, like I said, childless. And again, to take some blame off of David, right? So why did Michal maybe remain childless? Okay. Remember that Michal is one of the few, surviving members of Saul's royal family. And as a result, any child she had, right, especially a child fathered by David, right, this child would have much more better claims to the throne than even David himself. And one does wonder whether it is not Michal's fault that she remained childless, but whether it was David's fault, right? David probably, or maybe, did not want to have a son with Michal, lest that son, like Jonathan maybe, right, try to take the throne that is more rightfully his. Okay. David, as evident, is again a master politician. Okay, and in being a master politician, the presence of these stories about Saul's family in particular, it speaks to the PR problem that David faced when he became king. No matter how well things turned out at the end, David always would remain, a usurper, someone who is not a blood relation of Saul, and yet who came to the throne in place of Jonathan, the war hero. Okay. These stories therefore try to address and mitigate these charges. It tells you how, oh, Jonathan loved David so much, knew that he was going to become king, even helped him escape. And not only Jonathan, but Michal loved him. Everybody loved him. Okay. And oh yeah, by the way, Michal is his wife. So, he's kind of belongs to, that is David, kind of belongs to the family of Saul. Okay. And oops, too bad there were no legitimate heirs from that family. Okay. So notice how, right, all of these things are slyly being addressed in this narrative, okay? And they're almost insinuated as part of God's mysterious plans, right? And sometimes as the result of not God's mysterious plans, but of course of Saul, Michal, and Jonathan not playing the political game, the Game of Thrones. I mean, this is what this is, right? Badly, right? Or not as well as David. And indeed, that probably is what led to their downfall, that it is David who played this game much, much better.